Martin. I'm slightly overwhelmed by that poem. I didn't know that she'd done that. Particularly by the choir. That was stunning. And it made me think back to when I was 16, which was 1984, in case you're wondering. 1984, I grew up in Oxford, and very near Oxford was a place called Greenham Common. And normally only women were allowed at Greenham Common, but teenage boys were allowed various things. There was a debate between the commander of the camp, the American commander of the camp, and an obscure priest called Bruce Kent in a church. And the American commander of the nuclear camp at Greenham Common started off and explained why, if we were not strong and we didn't have all his missiles, it would all be over and you only got anywhere through strength. And this little priest got up and just said, "I don't think the man above your head would agree," which was a slightly smaller version of the crucifix behind me, and just floored him. That's part of my background, if you want to get an idea. It will get more nerdy later on. You only got 25 more minutes of it as well, in case you're wondering how long I'll go on for. You introduced me as coming from Oxford, so I should tell you something about what's going on in Oxford at the moment. We don't tend to have the most radical students. We tend to get the people coming who spend far too long working in their bedrooms at home on their GCSEs and A-levels. Like the radical students tend to go to other universities. But this week, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer complained that the university had been slow to act against some of our protesters. Because even the students at Oxford protest. I want to tell you about two students, which you probably haven't heard about. One angry young man in the left-wing group, could be communist. He got a copy of a famous painting called Guernica. He knows one yet, he got it from Picasso. And he stole his way into the senior common room at Balliol College and put it up as a protest about what was going on. There was another who formed a group who produced a play about a terrible situation in which people are concentrated together and then killed. Now you may be wondering why I'm telling you about this and telling it fairly obscurely, but I can tell you their names. They're absolutely safe because they're dead. The young man was called Dennis Healy. The year was 1938, and he was protesting against the fact that the university was so complacent that there was going to be a genocide to come. The young woman who wrote the play, creating a concentration camp on Christchurch Meadow, if you know Oxford, much to the distress of the university authorities. Her name was Iris Murdoch, and she was a left-wing activist student in 1938. Okay, the students have always been right. The students have always been dramatically ahead of the academic staff at my university. Nobody remembers who the Vice-Chancellor was in 1938, or who any of the dons were, who said, "Don't worry your little heads about this. It'll all be sorted out," which of course it wasn't. And the students were right in 1968, and the students were right in the 1980s. One college still plays at the end of every night to tell people that they've got to go home. Free Nelson Mandela. Every night in the bar. And the students have been right for the last 2 years as they've been putting up tents and protesting in my university. And the Prime Minister and Penn Valley Police and the Secret Services are not on the right. What radicalised the students in my university the most? Because they're not particularly radical. And when all this began, most students were trying to get on with their studies. What radicalised the students in my university the most about the current atrocities is when the university called in the police and a dozen of them were arrested. Those kind kind of actions. Young 18, 19 and 20-year-olds suddenly notice if one of their friends is arrested by the police because the university have called them in, because the university was scared of a dozen 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Mostly young women, by the way. Much smaller than the police officers who arrested them. That's a taste of the current problems we have, the woes we have. And it's very, very easy to feel down about the world, particularly now. I may have got my day wrong, I'm sure one of you will know, will tell me. I have a feeling that it was the Bishop of Oxford on the Today programme today who fought for the day. Was I right?
Yes.
Oh, good. And he was talking about hopelessness and despair. And I think Ian McEwen had written about how it's a time of hopelessness and people can't see the future and so on. And certainly there's data, we'll get onto data, don't worry about this. But I think Richard Harris, or whatever he's called, Bishop of Oxford, kind of went through other hopeless times. It was interesting, he mentioned Stalin and he mentioned Mao. Not a thing about anything bad we ever did, anyway. But this sense of now is the time in which you might despair about what is happening about the world. The 1930s, in a way, were similar. But we didn't despair as much. I haven't got any slides. The book's on sale at the back, if you don't believe me. But the book contains a series of graphs, and the first graph in the book is an attempt to work out, well, how much do we worry? How much do we think we're in a crisis? How much is there hopelessness? One thing I did was to look at the frequency of the use of the word crisis in the English language. You can start off at the year 1800, I'll draw you a graph. 1800, 1810, 1820, 1830, lots of wars in Europe, lots of diseases, lots of epidemics, lots of pandemics, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, First World War. It's flat. Flat, the use of the word crisis. Little rise in the 1930s, and then down again in the 1930s, down again in the 1940s. I'm running out of space on my graph. The use of the word crisis zooms up in the 1960s. With the most obvious one being the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then it drops slightly. Then it goes even higher in the 1970s, drops slightly, even higher in the 1980s, if you remember when we were 3 minutes to midnight or 2 minutes to midnight on the nuclear clock. Drops down slightly, goes even higher in the 1990s. There's a pattern here. Nothing. Down slightly, gets pretty high to quite a high number in 2019, which is when they stopped measuring it. Now, I can absolutely guarantee you that when the year 2020 data comes out, it's going to be higher than ever. But the key thing is, if you had done your O-levels or CSEs in 1984 like me, you've lived in your entire life in a time of crisis, polycrisis, concern and fear. If you measure it, if you look at it, it's not just the last few years. Now, I can't necessarily explain why it is. I have ideas about why it might be. I think it is partly because more of us, this is a worldwide statistic, more of us have been allowed to read and write and think beyond the very basic level. We've been allowed to stay out of school to 15, to 16, to 18. More of us have been allowed to go to university. More of us have been allowed and encouraged to find out about the rest of the world. And we worry. And we also have time to worry because there hasn't been a hot Third World War. We don't have constant cholera outbreaks anymore. In fact, the frequency of pandemics has reduced over time. The last big one before COVID-19 was AIDS. The flu pandemics raged in 89, 1918, sometime in the 1930s, 1957, 1968, a million died. I was in that one, I was a baby. My dad couldn't get out of bed for a week, he tells me. 1977, and then quieter. The terrible, terrible things going on in the world But our capacity to look at them, think about them, worry about them, say we cannot carry on like this is greater than ever. So part of the reason why we're in a crisis is we actually know we're in a crisis. We don't have the optimism that we had after the Second World War that everything was going to be great. There was a baby boom after the Second World War, not just because the men had just come back from the war, it carried on. Because people were optimistic about the future and bringing children into it. And of course here in this country, the baby boom was worldwide. There'd just been revolution in China, there'd just been partition in India. These things cause turmoil and then you get lots of babies, but it was worldwide. But here, you could get a house in your early 20s, there was full employment. It was a time to be optimistic. If you ever wonder why people are having so few children in the world now, it's falling everywhere. It's almost no exception. I do wonder to what extent it is awareness of the problems of the world which is partly causing this. What makes me think this the most, I've only got about 10 minutes left, what makes me think about this the most is that even in the most progressive of Nordic countries, where childcare is free, where the people who are working in the nurseries have master's degrees, where every child gets a free school holiday, where the gender parity ratio is equal, almost. In the case of Norway, 12% ahead for young women. Even in the nearest thing we've ever seen to utopia, people are having an average of 1.3 children. And possibly they're doing that because they look out at the world and what they see worries them. So, I measure things. What are the biggest worries in the world? There are different ways of doing this, but what I use in this book, in the next crisis, is Ipsos Mori's surveys of about 30 countries, and the Chinese Academy of Social Science survey, which is similar, which asks people what three things most concern them and gives them a list. There are different things. This is a survey. So essentially, it's a survey of the world's middle class, the best of 4 billion people, because poorer people don't fill in surveys. A lot of it's done on the internet. They don't have that. Right? So these are the concerns of better off people, in general, as a bias. The number one concern by far, for the last few years, and for longer, is cost of living, inequality and poverty. The number one concern of the world's middle class. Before the cost of living crisis rose during the pandemic, it was inequality and poverty, just on its own. So it is the major worry. It's rising now because Elon Musk's wealth is more, I think, or projected next year to be more than the poorest half of everybody in the USA. 5 of the 7 richest men in the world stood behind Donald Trump when he was inaugurated. In the future, we'll have a word for this kind of a world society in which there is so much concentrated money in so few hands. But most people's concern are local. They see poverty around them, they worry about it for themselves, and if not for themselves, for their children or their future grandchildren or their cousins. It's just there. But it's the number one concern in surveys. And this may surprise you. You can look at different groups, and it isn't always. It's not the number one concern in China, despite the fact that China has the same inequality level as the USA. It's not the number one concern of young graduates in Europe, which is climate. But it is the number one concern overall for most people. The second concern shocked me when I first saw it. The second concern, greatest mentioned, it used to be the first, is unemployment. And it's a shock if you live in Britain when you see that, because we officially have a very low unemployment rate. But you wouldn't believe how many people are frightened of being made unemployed. What happens to me if I don't keep my job? Or how many young people are afraid that they're never going to get a job or a decent job. Right? That fear is really real, and it's individualised. It's only when you do a survey that you can actually get people to tell you what it is that they're most concerned of. The first concern, cost of living, inequality and poverty, is, will I have enough? The second concern is, will they need me? Will I be useful? And you can link the second concern to things like concerns about immigration, which is almost entirely because of the way we frame it. Immigrants create jobs. If you haven't worked that out, if people come into your city, that creates more demand for more people. The worst thing that can happen to any place in the UK is people don't come. And we know this because there are places to which people don't come. And then the place is doing very, very badly. But that concern about will I be needed or will my family be needed can be translated into fear about others if it's manipulated by politicians to do that. The third concern, crime. They're coming to get my stuff. Violence, being mugged, war. Of course, globally, the concern about war goes up and down, and geographically, it's greatest in the countries next to a country having a war. But that fear of insecurity is incredibly high in people. The next is basic services. Education, hospital, will they be there, will they work, will there be corruption? It's actually the number one concern in China, is healthcare. Partly because there's a feeling that the state has sorted out the other things. You will not be unemployed. You will not be poor compared to how your grandparents were, despite the huge inequality. And your government really doesn't appear to want to go to war, as far as people in China are concerned. Of course, America's really peaceful and China's really, really warlike. And then only then you get to climate crisis. We are the number one country in the world for most believing in the climate crisis. Only 9% of people think it's fake in the UK. Political coalition of the major political parties and major media players gets you up to 91% of people noticing not only, you'd have to be kind of blind not to notice now it's getting hotter, but actually believing it. But that proportion is dropping because you get a fatigue about being told again and again, especially being told by people who are well off, people who don't have to worry about money, people who don't even think that unemployment is a problem, people who don't worry about theft because they don't live in a place where that is likely to happen to them, people who don't worry about war because they have a home in another country they can flee to. If you ever wonder what it is to be actually rich, my personal definition of rich is having enough money so you have an escape route out. So climate, when it's about climate, despite the fact that the temperature is rising, you're actually falling. And the final one I put in the book is concern about the environment, about losing species, about things that are actually irreversible. And that's distant in many people's minds and aware. So those are the lists of the major concerns. Why have I done this or written a book about this? I have to be honest, I got too depressed about writing books about Britain. So it's actually less depressing to write a book about the concerns of people worldwide. But it was partly to try to order the big worries. Because if you have a set of worries, of things that you worry about, one way of dealing with them is to say, well, what is my biggest? What is my next? And are the solutions to these worries at conflict with each other? And the great news is that they're not. The great news is that if, and in those places where a small amount of people are not allowed to control the great amount of wealth and money, where you achieve that in those countries in the world that achieve it, there is actually less precarity, less real unemployment. There is less violent crime. There is a lower propensity to go to war. There is a better health service. Often a health service that will see you within a few days or a few weeks in some Nordic countries. Or which spends an extra €1 billion a week on public health, which is the case of Germany. If you remember that 350 million extra we're going to get on the NHS if you voted to leave. Germany back then already spent an extra €1,050 a week. And had 3 to 4 times more ventilators in the spring of 2020. Those are the kind of things that matter. All of the big problems that people are most concerned about in the world have similar solutions. And those solutions are not radically different to the ones that have been pushed for a couple of 100 years. If I was showing you a set of slides, I'm going to end in a few minutes to answer a few questions. If I show you a set of slides, my last slide are the 10 commandments of the Socialist Sunday School movement. I doubt anybody here went to a Socialist Sunday School, but you might. It's in the end of the book, so if you really want to know, you can just Google it as well. But the 10 commandments of the Socialist Sunday School movement from a century ago. Seen as seditious, dangerous at the time. Because of course it was, and this was by diverting people away from this established church, teaching children dangerous ideas. If you read the 10 commandments of the Socialist Sunday School now, they're as meek as anything. Right? We don't count our achievements, we don't count our blessings. It's partly good that we don't, that we're not satisfied, that we don't think we've done enough. That's why we keep going and keep pushing. That's why we don't have children in gutters. Yes, they're in a single bedroom with their parents in emergency accommodation in a hotel, but they're not in a gutter. We keep on pushing things forward. We do have, in this country, the highest taxation for 70 years. It's just lower, and in some cases much, much lower, than every other major Western European country, which taxes its population more and gives them more back again. Partly because the UK does so badly on European league tables, things are almost certainly going to get better over the next few decades, because it's really hard to preserve this position. I'm trying to be optimistic because I'm coming to the end, but this is not entirely a stupid argument. It takes a lot of effort, really, it doesn't have my accent. It takes a lot of effort to take this country, I'll name this country rather than the world. It takes a lot of effort to take it from being the second most equitable European country after Sweden in the 1980s, up to being the most unequal on a par with Bulgaria for the last 10 years. That takes work, it doesn't happen by accident to do that. It takes a lot of effort to demolish the most successful social housing scheme on the planet, first introduced by the British, council housing, in which a majority of children born in 1946 lived at some point in their childhood and got in the slums, and to privatise the comprehensive schools, which the Finns copied and made better. They're now academies, no democratic control and no amounts of corruption. And a lot of effort at the moment to try to dismantle parts of the NHS. It's a lot of work to do this. You don't end up in this situation by accident. And if you are in that situation, the people who want us to be that unequal are going to have to work very, very hard to keep it. Recently, the Sunday Times, which used to produce a list of the 1,000 richest families, dropped the bottom 750. I think because they're not doing so well. It's only a small fraction now of the top 10%. In some cases, part of the top 1% of people by income who are seeing their money in terms of greed get better. We still have people individualising the fact that things are hard for themselves, blaming themselves because they can't get a job, blaming themselves because it costs them a fortune to house themselves, because a quarter of our children are in private rented. We need to remember that when I was a child, every child in Britain had security attending. As long as your parents paid the mortgage or paid the rent, you weren't going to be made homeless. We managed to get rid of that. Because we do so badly in the UK, the steps required to get ourselves off the bottom are minimal. I'll end by giving you an example of a country that shows how we can do better. There's a country which identified during the pandemic that there was a new crisis emerging, and the crisis was the cost of living crisis. Prices were rising by 30% in a couple of years, and they were most worried about the effects of this on child poverty. That country decided to do something about it. It increased income tax, little bit for the rich, not very much, and it gave families who were in receipt of any benefit an extra £10 a week for any child under 6. And having got it in by principle, this is in the pandemic, it then increased the eligibility, so now it's about £30 for every child under 16 in the family, about 2 out of 7 children in this country. Family of 3 children, that's about £4,000 a year. So in this country, and it's not tapered, they get to keep it. So in this country, no child need go cold and hungry. And that's happened really recently. But the problem is it's happened in a country far, far away that we can't possibly emulate, where they speak strange and have different customs. The country is called Scotland. Scotland now has the lowest child poverty rate in the UK. Right? If you ever feel like despairing, it is so easy to point to possibilities. To me, I think the only serious danger, because I don't think we're genetically or inherently stupid as a set of English people, the only serious big danger that we may not be able to overcome is that the few men with far too much money in the States decide they want to fund a think tank in London, let's say 300 million, and buy our politics because they've just won and purchased the United States, and we will be a nice prize next. That's my major worry for the UK. I can't believe we would allow it to happen, but it's a danger. And how do you confront a danger like that? You talk about it. You say, this is not impossible. Don't let that happen. Don't let us become a playground of American billionaires. But be optimistic about what's happening in general, because in general, apart from a small rise in the last 16 years, the number of deaths in wars has been going down in the world. The number of babies dying in the world is at a historic low, and it will get lower again. The number of people in education in the world is still expanding massively, including university expansion. Rights for women are increasing everywhere, almost, apart from small places that contain only 4% of the world's population, like the USA. Only 4% of the world's population. Things are getting better in most cases, most of the time. There's no need for despair, but if we want our children and grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, which might be more realistic, to have 2 children each, we need to make it better than it is. Otherwise, we're going to be ageing as a population for decade after decade after decade. Long after we peak in the 2080s or 2070s, possibly at less than 10 billion. And for the first time in our history of species, it's going to come down. And you might think it's good, it's probably good, we can handle it and it'll be fine. But you don't want it to keep on going down forever. You want to have a world in which young people are optimistic enough to want to have their own little young people with them. If you want a measure of what's currently wrong in the world and what affects people everywhere, it is that people are so afraid of starting a family. It's not because they can't afford to, because the drops of bees are much better off. It's what is the world into which I will be bringing this child. And I think we should be thinking more and more about that. And it's much easier, I think, politically to argue for a different world if you're actually arguing not just for children, which is also always politically easier than arguing for adults, but you're arguing for the generation that have not yet been born, because we have not yet made the world a good enough place for people to want them to be born. Thank you very much for putting up with me.